Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Tanya Billsbury, and I'll be talking about my research with Stephen Smith and Caitlin Carter-Rogers at St. Mary's University on racial and criminal record discrimination, which we studied experimentally in a simulated hiring scenario. So we all need work. Work is how we contribute our skills to our community, it's how we take care of our families. It's really important to social inclusion. And yet there are some folks that have a much harder time finding work. For folks with criminal records, hiring discrimination is one of the biggest barriers that they face. And it's important to know that discrimination can be legal or illegal. Discrimination based on race is illegal in Canada, it's legal in the States, it's legal in many places. But this is about laws, so it's about jurisdiction. And in some jurisdictions, certain kinds of discrimination are in fact legal. Now, everywhere you go, it's legal to discriminate based on your qualifications, right? Based on the bona fide occupational requirements of the job, that's just fine. But can they discriminate based on socioeconomic status? Can they look at you and say, nah, it won't fit? Can they discriminate based on sexual orientation? Some places they can, some places they can't. And sometimes they can legally discriminate on the basis of criminal record status. Okay? In British Columbia, they can't do that. But where I'm from, in Nova Scotia, they can. And they do. And I'm not sure what the situation is in your jurisdiction. But do you think that criminal records are equally distributed across the different races and genders? I see you shaking your head no. Who gets more of those? Who is more criminalized?
Well, we're going to jump into stereotypes, so...
Yeah. It's not the white men, okay? And where I'm from, it's often Black men and Indigenous men. Where I'm from, our key marginalized groups in Nova Scotia are the First Peoples, the Indigenous people, and then the Black folks who are historical settler communities who are descended from slaves. And that's not quite the same as immigrants from Africa who might have a very class privileged background. It's important to keep that in mind when I come to affirmative action, which is where this is leading to. Now, there's been all kinds of great experimental research on hiring discrimination, racial discrimination in hiring, and one of my favorite papers is by Deva Pager. It's published in the American Journal of Sociology, and she had very closely matched Black and white, they were undergraduate students, they were actors, go out and apply for the same jobs using the same resumes, pretty much. And what do you expect happened? And some of these fake resumes had criminal records. And what this suggests is that, well, white men are more likely to be hired than the Black actors, given the same qualifications, same everything else. And when there's a criminal record, it drops to about by 50%. So they're half as likely to be hired when they're white. So you see that effect of the criminal record. But see that it seems to be stronger for the Black men. They're going down from about 15% to 5%. This was marginally significant. Didn't quite reach that p-value of 0.05. But we actually do find this study, we do find this interaction in the study that I'm presenting today. So keep in mind, there's direct discrimination. You have direct discrimination based on your race. Then you can have indirect discrimination. So we're not going to say it's about your race, but you're a woman. What would be a good way to indirectly discriminate against a woman?
Recruitment.
Sorry?
Recruitment.
How might you do it? You're saying no to this person, not because she's a woman, but what else? Could you do it indirectly, more subtly? Could it be something like, well, you're not allowed to pump your breasts in here, right?
How often can you go on a long trip to the other side of the world?
So there could be,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So it might be harder for women to leave their families. And so that would be, and requiring that kind of extensive travel would be a way to indirectly discriminate against women. I've already mentioned that the key marginalized groups we're looking at in this study are historical Black community and the First Nations. Now, in our lab, we tried using names that sounded like these different groups. Kyle sounds like a white guy. Tyrone sounds like a Black man. And then we had Stuart Pegamagaba. We used the surnames to give the impression that the resume, the bogus resume, belongs to a man of one of these different groups. And we looked at hiring rates for when there was and when there wasn't a criminal record. And this particular pilot study was suggesting a really strong deficit for the indigenous names. And we weren't sure what was going on there, or whether it had anything to do with the fact that it was a labor job, because folks from different races are affected by different stereotypes when they're applying for jobs. So in Canada, the nasty stereotypes about indigenous people is that they're lazy, okay? So maybe that's why they don't want to hire them for a labor job, which would be hard work. But then the stereotypes about Black men is that like they're big and strong and maybe ideal for working in an exploitative job and hard physical labor, right? So is that why we saw a bit of over-selection for the Black men? Maybe it was something about that labor role, right? Because these stereotypes are going to come into hiring, and in some cases they might increase the selection ratio. Like let's say, oh, it's a woman and women are good nurses, let's hire a woman to be the nurse. Or then it could act against them, like perhaps in this case with the indigenous men and the labor job, if our stereotype is that they're lazy. And what about stereotypes about criminals? And in Pager's study, there was a criminal, an applicant with a criminal record was hired on the spot when the applicant without the criminal record was not hired because it was dirty work. Right? They saw the actor with the criminal record as suited for dirty work. So we weren't sure what was going on there, and we thought, let's go and find 3 jobs that are not perceived to be sort of differentially associated with men of different races. So I started with a list of 36 entry-level jobs. And we wanted to see, are some of these seen as more Black jobs? Are some of them seen as more white jobs? Are some of them seen as more indigenous? And are there any we could use that are race neutral? And we used MTurk participants for this, who are mostly male and mostly white. And we asked them, well, like, you know, compared to other men in Nova Scotia, like how likely is it that, say, a white Nova Scotia man would be working in the particular job? Or how likely is it that a Black man would be working in a particular job? One of the most surprising findings is the white men were seen as more likely to be working across all jobs. And indigenous men are seen as less likely to be working across all jobs. That was the main effect that came out that we weren't expecting. This is our list of jobs, and so we're more likely to, we think that a lifeguard is more likely to be white. Okay, we might think that a camp counselor or a collections agent is more likely to be white. But dishwashers, sanitation workers, garbage collectors, gas station attendants, seen as more likely to be Black or indigenous. You see there's even fewer jobs that were identified for indigenous men. But we did get some that weren't seen, that didn't have that differential kind of association, and we picked 3 of them for this study. And they were construction worker, tree planter, which totally surprised me because I thought that it would be indigenous associated, but it wasn't. Maybe that's because a lot of rich white kids go tree planting, I don't know. And mailroom clerk. And then we wanted to see what would happen if we use these bogus resumes that we're going to experimentally manipulate the names on. And then we'll randomly assign someone to have criminal records or not. What's gonna happen when we ask people to make a hiring decision for a job that the person is totally qualified for? So what's gonna happen in this hiring situation is that we have an entry-level job, the person is given a resume, the person is absolutely qualified. Are you gonna hire them? Yes or no? And if not, why not? And the why not gets interesting, okay? just a basic resume. We used 2 of them to make sure there wasn't a resume level effect. This is what the criminal record check looked like. Fun fact, there were some cases where people misreported that there was a criminal record when there wasn't. This happened more likely when the candidate had a racialized name. Right, you could misread that. So we asked them, will you hire them? Okay, how likely are you to hire them? And then, are you going to do it? Right, because the likelihood rating is different from the actual decision. And the decision is that yes, no, and if not, why not? And we asked some questions about them, like how qualified, how competent, how likable, that sort of thing. So our participants came from MTurk and from the psychology department subject pool. And here's our results for the sample of 400-ish that you read about in the abstract. And you can see here that we do get that interaction that Deva Pager was, that statistically significant interaction showing that a criminal record, the weight of a criminal record is heavier for a Black man. It's also heavier for an Indigenous man, but not quite so heavy. Okay, so we found that. Now, we've collected more data since then, and what we've actually found is that when there's no criminal record, Black men are a bit over-selected for these low-wage jobs. I don't know, professional jobs, low-wage jobs. But as soon as you add the criminal record, the punishment's intense. Okay. So, candidates with a criminal records are seen as less trustworthy, they're seen as less likable, they're seen as more deceitful. But it actually didn't affect the perceptions of like qualifications or competence. It was very much a trust thing. What got interesting was these reasons why. And we were seeing that when the candidate was racialized, we're rejecting them for what looks like more reasons. Like, this thing's wrong, is that thing wrong, and the other thing's wrong. Only resumes with Black names had these comments about lack of professionalism. These are the same resumes. Okay? The exact same resumes. We're just changing the ethnicity of the name. And here, someone's saying, we're not going to hire this Black candidate. The formatting of the resume looks unprofessional, and the information that's presented is at times unclear. For instance, they didn't indicate that they had graduated from high school, just that they went. It sounds like they're kind of like trying to find things to pick on that they don't like. There was only one case when a resume was rejected because maybe this person could do better than that low-wage job. Guess what? Came with a white name. Unless the applicant had a physical disability, they would be a poor fit for the monotony of a male clerk. So maybe if this white guy was disabled, then he could have this job, but otherwise, no, not good enough. Here's an example that came from somebody that took the test over twice. People on MTurk sometimes will take tests more than once. We excluded these from the main analysis, but they could be quite telling. And I want to show you what happened here. So this is a 52-year-old white woman, and in one condition, she's given the resume for Kyle Richards. Okay? And she rates just at a 4, kind of neither likely nor unlikely to hire, not so sure here. And then she goes and hires him. The decision is yes. Okay? And he has a criminal record. Kyle has a criminal record. And his qualifications, competence, trustworthiness, are marked 3 out of 7. Deceitfulness is at a 3, and likability is at a 2. That's interesting because now let's look at the Indigenous name. Sam Aminia also has a criminal record, just like Kyle. But now we're slightly unlikely to hire him, and we're not going to hire him. Okay, the decision tips that way. And why not? Because he has a criminal record. But we don't care if he's white and has a criminal record. That's that interaction effect. And look at those ratings, 333. Sam is actually seen for whatever reason as less deceitful and more likable. But he's still not getting a job because he has that criminal record. So we found strong evidence of indirect discrimination that is based on race. Okay? Participants in this study did not show any awareness whatsoever of their racial bias. What they're doing is deflecting it onto the criminal record and saying, you know, we don't want criminals around here. Or they're deflecting it onto things like professionalism. You know, maybe this person's not a fit, could be not enough experience. And all of this, to me, strongly supports the need for affirmative action. Because if there is a desire to exclude people from a certain race, well, no one's going to say we're not hiring this person because they are Black or because they're Indigenous. They're not going to say that. They're not going to let them take you to court over that. But they could make it about something else. Make it about something that seems legitimate. And there's kind of bottomless ways to do that. You know, it could be something they're more likely to have, like a criminal record, because they're more likely to be criminalized. Could be picking on their professionalism or the way they speak or show up on an interview. They want to find something, they are going to find something. And so my argument is that that is why we need affirmative action. And once we have that, it's important, I will add, to watch for diversity deception. So if there's a position and it's an affirmative action position that maybe ought to go to a person from the Black community that's historically been in that location, that's descended from slavery. In some organizations where they practice more, I would say, diversity deception, they're gonna hire a very class privileged immigrant that has the dark enough skin so it kind of looks like they're serving the underserved community when they're really not. And another thing we see a lot of in academia, in hiring for affirmative action positions for Indigenous folks, is actually giving the position to a white person with braids and a blanket and beads who heard a rumor from their great-grandmother that her great-grandmother was Cree, so they identify as Indigenous. But they actually have no connection to the local Indigenous community. So if we are going to do affirmative action, there are better ways to do it. And that may involve actually working with those local communities in some way. Some limitations to this study: we didn't control for crime types. When somebody hears that a Black man has a criminal record, do they imagine it's something like worse, something more violent than when a white man has a criminal record? And you think, like, DUI? We only tested 3 jobs, so I can't really say this generalizes beyond those 3 jobs and out of the low-wage marketplace and into the professional labor marketplace. I don't know. It's not a real hiring scenario. Okay? We're not using real HR workers. Candidates aren't being compared against other candidates. We only gave people 1 resume because we were trying to control for demand characteristics at that point. We didn't want people to figure out what we were doing. Right? The participants aren't real employers. Okay? And there's no organizational context. What we did have, though, was a very, very strong experimental design where we were able to find that effect that other researchers were not. And my final sort of limitation is that, like most studies on hiring, on employment discrimination, are about that easy to study kind of recruitment and hiring phase. But once somebody from an equity seeking group is in the organization, what happens to them in terms of promotion? What happens to them if someone tries to push them out and they're subject to complaints and to discipline? Are those processes fair? There's so much more going on here, and I do want to acknowledge that most of our research is going at that hiring discrimination phase, partly because it's easiest to study, because you can send these resumes off and these actors out, but what organization is going to let you in as a researcher to study their discrimination and write articles about it? They might not be motivated to do so. That brings me to the end of my presentation. You can find my contact information and Steve's contact information there. And I'll acknowledge the contributions of Caitlin Carter-Rogers, an Indigenous scholar at St. FX. She couldn't be on this as an author because she already had 3 presentations in, but she totally should be. Any questions I can answer? Yes.
Right, it reminds me of the first paper I published on diversity. I wanted to identify the dimensions of diversity. And one of the dimensions I found is that the companies will not discriminate people wearing tattoos or piercing. But I've never seen in a bank or in a hotel having people in front of customers wearing a lot of piercing and tattoos.
Like with a tattoo. So
Yeah.
tattoos are strongly associated with socioeconomic status. Poor folks are more likely to be tattooed. And so perhaps they're discriminating based on SES, and it's likely they can do that legally.
That's what I call hidden
Yeah.
discrimination. I mean, it's not direct or indirect, it's what I call hidden discrimination. And there are many cities in France that they are close to your topic, because in France, if your name is Mohammed, you have far less, well, sorry, I hope there's no Mohammed in the room, you have far less chance to get recruited, because you
Yes.
have all these stereotypes or whatever that you have on the name. So you have like direct discrimination,
Yeah.
and companies are not, and still exist, and companies are not, punished for that. So if you're interested, there are many studies. in
And
France
that's why I
dealing with
think the answer is affirmative action, because otherwise they'll find a way not to hire.
Yeah, but we can't do that in France because it's against the French constitution. That's the reason why the word inclusion, in fact, could not be applied to the French. And that's very proud. Anyway, that's another.
And I saw a hand here.
I was coming more from a practitioner perspective.
Yes.
I've interviewed around 200, maybe about 220 academic hires. So think about that in terms of applicants. It's a fairly large pool of many thousands. In business schools, but in other disciplines, anthropology, etc. And when you were asking the question, what would make people discriminate and how would it happen? I think what I found is that it happens at two stages. It happens in screening, where there's a rarefied assumption that institutions you know are excellent and institutions you don't know are really bad. Most of the places you don't know happen to be outside your racial
Yes.
profile. And there are ways that you can do that. For example, Oregon created a huge data set so that now we screen by the data set, so that it doesn't matter whether you know the institution or not.
So yes, prestige of institution would be something that would be connected
But no,
to.
actually it's nothing to do
It's
with
not.
prestige at all, which I think is a misunderstanding. When you're actually in the room and doing it, it's not prestige, it's awareness. There's a fundamental difference. So frequently people would ascribe a place where they've been as far more prestigious than it actually is, sometimes by as many as 500-600 rank points when you check it out. So they'll say the University of X is a great school, the University of Y, where the black person has to be, is a really bad school, and yet the place where the black person's from is 500 points higher. So it's nothing to do with that, it's to do with an inbuilt way of how you get around things. And in the interviews they do consistently two things against people who are not of their group, whatever that group is. They consistently talk a lot about context. So not just in the questions of them, but when you're coming afterwards and you're making the selection decision, they'll start to emphasize things like, well, that person couldn't understand how to be, like I recruit teachers as women, people who do teaching. White upper class women discriminate beyond belief is my
Yes, I
experience.
know.
So they constantly explain how, well, that person couldn't possibly understand the local context of teaching here, and actually they're being hired for something that doesn't even require that knowledge. And the other one that they do a lot is follow-up questions are far more inquisitorial to people who are not of the same grouping as you. So they'll ask a question asked and answered to a person who's similar to them, but somebody who's dissimilar to them, they'll ask the question, they'll get virtually the same answer, and they'll inquisitorially follow up question and keep on following up
Until they hear something they don't like.
until they hear something, not necessarily that they don't like, but that they believe other people would accept as the reason to not hire a person. So I think inside the mechanism is interesting to see how it works inside the box.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Any other questions?
We have time for one more question. If nobody else wants, I would take the chance. Did you look at any effects regarding the observer? Like, does it make a difference whether people of color make the decision, or woman or man,
Right.
or whatever, something
Our
like that?
sample was mostly white,
Hmm.
and there aren't enough people who took the test who are non-white,
Mhm.
and we'd be lumping all of them into non-white to run those analyses, and this is a problem in research of this nature on EDIA research. We typically study white people's perceptions of people of color. In this case, the people of color don't even exist, right? They're a name.
Yeah.
And then when we look at racialized individuals, we tend to lump them all into one kind of non-white group.
Yeah.
So that's another limitation of this study. But we have done some follow-up research where we talked to job seekers who had been recently incarcerated about the barriers that they were facing. I did go and give this presentation to a job developer network in Halifax, career specialists who work with people in this population, and the response was like, we already know this.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on where you want to go with that, but I think if you want to go to a top journal, my advice would be, okay, what is really new here? I mean, as you said, like, we know this interaction, we know there's discrimination against people of color, and I mean, I think the criminal record is even more obvious. So I think there is, you have a great foundation, and if you kind of can dig a little bit more deeper into the actual mechanisms, maybe with mixed methods or maybe with a follow-up study, something like that would take it to the next level for the next step. Yeah. Okay.